to the, to the beginning of to see where we started, where we're at today. And in 1999, Anne Arundel County Crisis Response was created. And at that time, it was to give patrol an alternative to arrest for someone in a mental health crisis. And at that time, they really only assisted people with mental health issues. I was still a patrolman then on our Northern Midnights, and never knew back then where we would be today from that start. Can you advance, please? So then, at the time, mental health clinicians responded to whenever patrol needed or asked for assistance with a mental health call. The clinicians had police radios, police call signs. As we've gone through the years, they started attending police lineup to build a stronger relationship with the police department, to become more of one between the police and crisis response. Next slide. So those calls, and it's really where we're at today. It's a complete partnership or integration between the police department and crisis response. Mobile crisis calls for service at the discretion of the patrolman. It's no longer just mental health. It can be mental health, but it could be a juvenile issue, a traumatic incident, homelessness, substance use, family violence, elderly issues. It's really any call for service that's not a traditional crime, or a call. It could be a crime in which a behavioral health response is more appropriate than a criminal justice response. It's really up to that officer or the supervisor to call the team out. Mobile crisis team then comes out and does an individual assessment on what can be done to help that person in need. Next slide, please. So in 24 is where a big change happened to where we are today. My partner, Jen, hopefully she'll make it back shortly. She recognized that follow-up wasn't happening on some of the calls where mobile crisis went out on. And some of you can think about some of the debate that's happening today with the defund the police movement. Our clinicians, our social workers, going to be responding to people who could be considered dangerous, who have weapons, have a past history of violence. To solve that question, Jen started doing research and learned about the Memphis model of crisis intervention team. And that's where you take a police officer who has a passion to help. They're self-selected. There are no voluntold to attend CIT training. And you take that officer, they have the passion to help, you give them the training, and then you partner them with a clinician, either a social worker or a therapist, to work together to respond to calls. And for us in our model, it's mostly doing follow-up for people after it's follow-up after an initial call for service, or after we've been asked to provide intervention for someone. The key for us, though, at the same time, we started our peer support team for the police department. Next slide. So where mental health first aid played a role. I know we were in Maryland, the first department to train every officer in mental health first aid. We did so in 2015. I did every class. And you can look at the change, look at the use of forces at the bottom of the screen. It was a 21% reduction between 2014 and 2015 when we trained the entire department in mental health first aid. Next screen. So this picture is actually from a barricade that happened 2 years ago, in which we're now at every major incident like this to assist the community with the trauma that they're going through. So in fiscal year 2019, mobile crisis teams responded to over 2,100 calls for service, of which 194 people were petitioned by the clinicians. Excuse me. However, The mobile crisis teams did almost 6,000 follow-ups on their own. Next slide. So to me, this is the key, and this is the changing of policing, that we're creating a culture of help. That not only are we there to help the community, we're also responding to help the trauma that officers go through. And that's where people don't really understand the trauma that officers are exposed to. They look at it and the trauma and say, or I should say that they look at this what calls for service and look at the stresses that are there. It's not the stress that gets the officers, it's the trauma. It's responding to that incident that shocks your conscience. And there is no definition. You just know it when you see it. It could be a SIDS baby. And think of the officer that responds and does CPR on a 1-year-old who dies and then has a 1-year-old home, their own, who may be wearing the same onesie or pajamas. Or you respond to the youth suicide and you're doing CPR on that child that's deceased. The fatal accidents we respond to. And it really, the list could go on and on, but it's that incident where we're responding, where the victims are vulnerable and innocent. And especially if it collides with our world. And what I mean by that is there's a personal relevance to it. What if you respond to a elderly neglect and you're taking care of your own elderly parent? And again, it could go on and on. So what we're doing, we're there to help officers with their trauma, as we expect officers to request us to help the community. And that's why I call it the culture of helping. It's changing the role and changing of how police help the community because they're getting help themselves. Next slide, please. So our SISM training, I'm an instructor, not just for mental health first aid, but also in critical incident stress management through the International Critical and Stress Foundation. Our officers on our peer support team have 30 hours training. It's a combination of 2 classes, assisting individual in crisis and group crisis intervention. And it expands on our CIT training and the mental health first aid. And it teaches communication skills, including the active listening, reflective listening, the unbiased listening, recognizing emotions, and it gives set procedures that we follow that we can adapt to almost any situation. It's utilized for officers as well as the community. And this is what the framework that we followed at the Capitol Gazette shooting when Jen and I were there with numerous of our officers and clinicians, assisting the officers that responded as well as the community, the co-workers who were not there when the incident happened, the Capitol Gazette employees who were in the newsroom, who were the survivors and then the families of the deceased from the incident. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So we develop a comprehensive critical and stress management response to traumatic incidents. It's become routine and expectation of us as a police department that we're there for the community as well as our officers. Next slide, please. So the CIT training, and it's really important that it's not just the training, it's the passion that officers have to help. The training gives them the tools and the skills to do that. So the Memphis model was started in 1988. Memphis Police Department unjustly killed a person with having a mental health crisis. The University of Memphis partnered with the Memphis Police Department and came up with the model. And the 3 spokes it's called a 3-legged stool. It's really important. Community collaboration among mental health providers. That we're working with those in the community there. Law enforcement, and then family and consumer advocates. We're close with NAMI. I'm actually on the Anne Arundel County NAMI Board of Directors. And in our training, Fred Delp, who's the executive director of Anne Arundel County NAMI, does a class on Anne Arundel County NAMI. But also we have other people with lived experience from NAMI that teach the class in our own voice during the training. And the unit it's not separate. It's just not another part of the police department. It's an expansion of the entire crisis response system for us. And that's where we take an officer trained in CIT, and anyone in the unit's also trained in CISM, mental health first aid, and they're partnered with a clinician. And it's the key is the passion to help as well as the training together. Next slide, please. So at a minimum, I just said that what the requirements are to be in the unit, but it's because they have that passion to help, and I can't stress that enough. And they're trained with the necessary tools to help someone in their time of crisis. And it's that combination that makes us successful. Next slide, please. So right now, and we just graduated another class last week. We were the first major police department to meet the International Association of Chiefs of Police One Mind Pledge, which means we have every officer trained in mental health first aid, and at least 20% of our department trained in CIT. We should have right now, I believe, 165 officers, which is almost 21% of the department trained in CIT. The key is, again, the officers have the passion. They're self-selected to attend the training, and we expect them and we teach them to self-deploy when they hear that call come out on the radio that's appropriate for a CIT response. We expect them to be leaders and to put themselves en route to that call. And it usually happens that way, as well as shift mates and supervisors expect officers with CIT training to be the ones to respond to calls where at face value, listening to the notes from dispatch that someone could be in crisis, or it's a traumatic incident, and that training will help with the community. Next slide, please. Some of the things that we do is we work with our homicide after all major traumatic incidents to assist the victim's family and the community after that major incident. And again, the critical incident stress management is the tool we follow for as part of our community policing model after traumatic incidents. Next slide. So these numbers are a little outdated. Right now, we're working with over 100 people, and we get them from all different avenues. So in 2019, a unit did 257 mental health assessments, 25 people times that they're emergency petitioned. We made over 1,300 follow-up visits and 8,100 contacts for that year. These are really we've already passed. Last month, we passed the 1,300 for this fiscal year. So we now have more officers in my unit. It's myself, a sergeant, and 8 officers in the unit. We have coverage from 7 a.m. to midnight every day with at least one team of officer clinician working. And as you can tell by the number of officers, there's times we're having 4 and 5 officers at a time working, and we're still not being able to keep up with the volume that we have. Next slide, please. So where do we get referrals from? And we're going to go more detail for all this, but diverting children from the criminal justice system to behavioral health, working with the Board of Education, making sure we have one integral county response, assisting people who were getting treatment who also have criminal charges, threats. We want to have a behavioral health response, not a criminal justice response. Hospital diversion, follow up for people when they're emergency petitioned. Our Safe Stations program, which I'll go in depth about. Think about people who are pawning a lot, not the person who goes into the pawn shop or you see on the TV shows with one item. I'm talking about the person that's pawning every day that is that if they need money, it's usually a social issue leading up to that. Next slide, please. Refers from when patrol calls out a mobile crisis team and the mobile crisis team recognizes that they need more in-depth follow-up than the mobile crisis team can do, they'll send it to our CIT unit. when people are repeatedly calling 911, homelessness, and alleged victims whose victimization is due to delusions, um, victims who are victims because of their mental illness, because they're taken advantage of. Suspects, and this is far and few between because most people with mental health in crisis or mental health concerns are victims more so than they're suspects. But when it does happen, we want to have a behavioral health response, not a criminal justice response. When schools need further assistance than what they're able to handle within the school system, and then consumers and family members who call into our 24/7 crisis response warm line. We've had a really big uptick. We're getting over 3,000 calls a month now, and some of it's with the defund the police movement. So instead of calling 911, they are calling in the crisis response for assistance. Next slide. So when a child is charged with an offense, our director of juvenile, our program director, Tamika Perkins, reads every one of those reports. And when she can determine that that child's behavior is due to a mental health challenge, it could be to a recent trauma. If anyone's familiar with Handle with Care, if a child's had Handle with Cares, and then in that proximity, they're charged with an offense, we look at it and say, okay, is the behavior because of the trauma that was there? The case is forwarded to us so that we can have a behavioral health response. It's not forwarded to the juvenile justice system. We coordinate when need be with the state's attorney and public defender if a case is forwarded. But when we're assisting these children and their families, we only have a 2% recidivism. And what that means is in the next year, that child, only 2% of the time, that child is charged with a criminal offense. Next slide. Pre-pandemic, we were meeting with the Board of Ed every month for children that we're working with that are also in the school system. And it's to make sure that we're all working together. The public defender's office is there, the state's attorney's office, the alternative education is there, just so that, again, there's a continuum of care for the child to make sure that we're providing the best we can for the child and their family. Next slide. This is something actually that I learned from a NAMI conference where I got the idea when I learned in a jurisdiction from an ACT team that they had someone who went inpatient, was stabilized, doing really well, had numerous warrants for petty offenses like shoplifting a dollar candy bar or trespassing and things like that. All the gains that were made while they were inpatient was lost when they went and the warrants were served and they went into the county detention center. So what we started doing is if someone has criminal charges and they're inpatient, and this happens a lot of times off of EPs, person's EP'd, they have criminal warrants, or even the warrant could be for behavior that they were EP'd on where they're charged that too. If they go inpatient into an inpatient psych unit, when they are discharged, we work with that hospital and coordinate their discharge to our unit. We walk them through the criminal justice system so that if they are released at the commissioner's office, we make sure that there's a good plan for their recovery to make sure that if there's a peace order, they're not walking out of the courthouse going back to violate the peace order, making sure they have a safe place to stay, make sure there's follow-up mental health treatment for them. When appropriate, we'll let the state's attorney's office know. Again, it's making sure that there is a complete continuum of care between the community providers. If someone's held and they go to bail review, we go to that bail review. And frequently people are released to our custody. And what I mean by that is they're released under the stipulation. The judge puts it in the pretrial motion that, or the pretrial order, that they must abide by their treatment plan. They have to sign releases so that if they're not, we can notify the court system if there's a problem with that. And again, the whole key is that there is a continuum of care between community providers. Next slide. Our Safe Station program, which I'm really proud of. Any Anne Arundel County resident can go to any police fire station in the county. One of our clinicians will respond and develop an individual recovery plan for the person seeking recovery. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including holidays, weekends. When that person's window of opportunity opens and they're sick and tired of being sick and tired, we're going to help them. The clinician does a complete assessment and develops a recovery plan, what's best for that person based on their resources. And it could be based on insurance, it could be on family and social supports, but it's what's best for that person. Next slide, please. So we work in the CIT unit to eliminate any barriers for treatment. And using what we'll say common sense, someone has arrest warrants, that'll stop them from getting into treatment. But what good does it do to serve the warrant when they're in active addiction or active withdrawal? They truly don't understand what's going on. We get them represented by the public defender's office. We coordinate with the public defender, state's attorney, and the judiciary, have the warrants recalled, criminal summonses issued, where they still have to go to court and held accountable or responsible for their behavior due to their addiction. However, they do it with a clear mind where they understand what's happening and going on. They go to treatment first, then court. And we actually take them to court, and they're not going in handcuffs. They go through the front lobby. We'll go with them and we'll testify on their recovery. And to me, it's pretty powerful when you have someone that may have been running from the police now embracing us as their social support. Next slide, please. If we can't quash the warrant, which really doesn't happen very often, we will walk them through the system. We'll get court dates, again, working with the judiciary, the public defender, state's attorney. If they're in treatment and they have a court date while they're in treatment, we'll get that case postponed so that they can complete treatment. The key is it's that person's treatment, that person's recovery, which is the priority. And we don't want anything to hinder their recovery. Some of our, the year before we did safe stations in Anne Arundel County, there was 1,824 burglaries. Last year, we only had 773. Our another traditional crime for someone from addiction is thefts. In the year before we started Safe Station, there was 44,366 thefts in the county. Last year, we only had 3,114. Huge theft from autos. Most people, it's not cars broken into, it's actually people leave their cars open and the person that's pillaging because of their addiction is actually walking around just trying door handles. The year before we started Safe Station, 3,000 theft from vehicle reports. Last year, 1,555. I mean, think about it, almost cut in half. Next slide, please. So hospital diversion. Every time an officer emergency petitions someone to the hospital, they have to write a report. We in the CIT unit get the reports and we work with our clinicians at crisis response. The clinicians, and I wish we could do every one of them, we prioritize them because there are days we have 9 EPs or 10 EPs a day. After a weekend on a Monday morning, when you look at Saturday, Sunday, or Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we may have almost 30 emergency petitions in Anne Arundel County. But the goal is to coordinate the treatment. So again, we have a continuum of care of treatment for that person. Next slide, please. So jail diversion. And again, this is one of those things that was affected by the pandemic. But the crisis response clinicians in the detention center daily for bail reviews. On low-level misdemeanors, the person is offered mental health treatment as a part of their pretrial release. Excuse me. Now, you can say that's great, but what happens if the person doesn't have, they get released and they don't have transportation, or they have other needs that need to be met? That's where the clinician does the assessment and comes up and finds out, what does this person need to be successful? Is it for their pretrial? Do they need a ride? What's more powerful than having one of our CIT officers picking that person up and driving them to pretrial? Again, being that social support, or us working to fulfill their Maslowian needs, making sure that they have something to eat, that they have clothing, that they have shelter, and there's a place for them. Again, it's the coordination of the continuum of care that makes it so successful. Next slide, please. So again, the case by case, looking at the report that the police department gets from pawn shops on what is being, how much money person's going to a pawn shop every day. Is it that it's stolen property, or is it that they're pawning their life away because there's a social issue? We reach out to them and ask them flat, and we're honest with them and tell them, we know that this is going on. Is there something we can do to help you? Because we want to be helpful, not hurtful. Next slide. So how utilize the mental health system? It's really important that, again, it's that continuum of care. People that were receiving a lot of mental health treatment, follow up in hospitals, constantly being EP'd, but not getting that continuum of care and the follow up with the appropriate mental health treatment. And that's where we work with the person to make sure they're getting appropriate treatment long term. Next slide. So our child diversion. We want to have a behavioral health response, not a criminal justice response when a child needs assistance. And again, this is really similar to what I said earlier, but some of the appropriate police department programs that we have: a teen court, children attending substance abuse treatment, community conferencing, and then joins juvenile offender in need of supervision. When we know that a child's behavior is due to a mental health concern or trauma, we want to provide them with that appropriate behavioral health response. So we divert them from the juvenile services to our CIT unit, and we want to have a full coordination with the school system, the state's attorney's office, and the public defender's office for that child and their family. And again, when we do this, there's only 2% recidivism, where the children we help are only charged with a criminal offense 2% of the time the next year. Next slide, please. So school threats. And 2 years ago, we really had a huge spike in school threats. We want to, again, make sure that we have a behavioral health response. We want to link children to appropriate mental health services when appropriate, but when a child says something stupid, we don't want it to be criminalized and criminal behavior, and then educate the child and their family on that it's inappropriate that happened, but we don't want to criminalize them. Again, we want to be helpful with our response, not hurtful to them. The criminal justice system is used as a last resort, and it's only when we determine that there is it's a threat. If the child or the family is not taking it serious and refuses assistance through the behavioral health system, the criminal justice system will be used. But again, it's only as a last resort. Next slide, please. We work hand in hand with our Homeland Security unit. Again, have that behavioral health response. We developed a threat assessment for police patrol based on the evidence-based model from the Virginia model of Dewey Cornell. Again, we do not want to criminalize a child, but we want to get them appropriate mental health services, because we want to reduce the likelihood that the threat will be carried out and stop future threats. We've actually expanded on our strategic threat assessment team, in which one of our clinicians now works hand in hand within the HSI unit, going through and having a clinical background, looking at all the threats to make sure that we have that appropriate response. Next slide, please. Actually, go ahead, next slide, please. This is so I went through really fast, but I'm looking at it as it gives us an opportunity to answer questions if anyone has any.
Lieutenant Thomas, thank you so much. I love that presentation. And as an Anne Arundel County person, I'm always so proud that we have a miraculous system in place. Folks, why don't you throw questions in the chat? And meanwhile, I have a couple questions for Lieutenant Thomas to start us off. Thomas, for individuals in different jurisdictions who would like to bring the model that you have talked about today to their jurisdictions, what are some recommendations that you could give those folks?
I think it's really working within the crisis system, whatever county you have. There are crisis systems in every jurisdiction for the most part, but making contact and utilizing them and making sure when it's calling them out to provide that assistance, as well as contact the local, the law enforcement agency, whatever it is, and ask them, what kind of training do their officers have? Have they had mental health first aid training? There's no reason why every officer in the state shouldn't have mental health training. It's now part of our initial recruit training. So in 2015, when we trained the entire department, since then, everyone coming in has been trained in mental health first aid at a minimum. And inquire about what percentage of their agency is CIT trained. Because the mental health first aid is a great beginning, but the CIT gives that expanded training of what you can do to help people in crisis, and hold your departments accountable in requesting that.
Excellent, thank you. First question that's come in is, do you work with fire EMS agencies, or is it just for the Anne Arundel County Police Department?
So we do work with the fire department in our Safe Station program. Safe stations, it's anyone can go to any police or fire station, but generally people go to the fire stations. There's a lot more of them. I believe it's 38 throughout the county, where in city of Annapolis, where for police districts, we have 4 in the county and 1 in the city. And plus the fire departments are more community based. So we do work with the fire department, and after some of the traumatic incidents, after some fires and some incidents like that, they will call us out to help.
Thank you. Here's the next question. Starting with a compliment. Very proud of Steve and Jen and all the work they have been doing. First question, whether anybody knows how many of Maryland's other LE units are using the Memphis model or replicating any portions of your program?
That it's different departments have different components. Prince George's County is working right now. I talked to Sergeant Plum a lot, where they're developing their own CIT program and expanding what they do with within their crisis system. I speak with my counterpart Brian in Baltimore County, where they have their own. So each department, it's based on what is unique to them in their crisis system.
Second half of this question, to what extent are restorative approaches being used for those individuals who may have criminal conduct that is dealt with as a mental/behavioral health issue, and how has that benefited the community as a whole?
So I know there are a lot of cases that are not forwarded us for children, but the police department, Tamika Perkins, our juvenile program director, does community conferencing herself, and working with the victims and those charged with the offenses. And again, the recidivism is extremely low in those cases.
Excellent, thank you. Next question. In terms of the follow-up care or connection with mental health services or treatment for addiction, how quickly does that happen? There are often long waits for services. And then a comment, thank you to Anne Arundel County CIT My family created the Hope Hunters Project to thank you and the responders and support safe stations. Can't thank you enough for the services you provide the families.
So we actually have appointments set aside in some of the community providers so we can get people in on short-term notice. We also use different resources within the community for safe stations. When someone wants assistance, especially on a weekend or overnight, you're not getting them into treatment right away. Even during normal business hours, it's really seldom we're going to get someone in treatment. Like if someone walked into a safe station right now, it'd be really difficult to get them in treatment today. We use some of the community resources to keep them in a place where they're safe. They're starting that recovery process. They're starting treatment until we can get them into a long-term treatment. And we have a lot of success with that. Of someone that goes into a safe station, I believe that it's approximately 75% go into long-term treatment. Of that 75%, it's over 60% are still sober 90 days out from when they went in asking for help.
Awesome. I have a question. You mentioned handle with care. Didn't really go into it. Can you circle back to that for the?
Sure. So Handle with Care is a program started out of West Virginia. And it's recognizing the effects trauma has on children. So whenever an officer comes in contact with a child or their family, and that child is exposed to trauma, and the trauma, it could be whatever it is. It could be that there's an overdose in the family. It could be that there was a domestic assault with the parents. It could be that someone was in a car accident. It could be the death of an elderly relative. It's just whatever it is that trauma is, that officer notifies Tamika, our juvenile program director. Tamika has access to the Board of Ed where she can just see the children's names and what school they attend. She will then send a generic email to the principal of the school that child attends and just says, handle this child with care. It doesn't give any other information. It just says if that child's having a bad day, there's a reason for it. It's not an excuse, but it gives a reason. And it lets the adults have some understanding that, okay, if the child doesn't have their homework or they're out of character that day, that there's a reason for it, and just to handle that child with care and have understanding.
Thank you. Another question that just came in. Most officers are getting the mental health first aid training in their initial academy, and we have mobile crisis on the Eastern Shore. Budget is an issue across the board for all agencies. How would you suggest these agencies that are smaller to be able to create a program within their budgeting restrictions?
So I would work with the crisis system that's already in existence. I mean, that's what we do. I work out of our crisis system. Now we have had the county, they just duplicate or doubled my unit, where it's now, it was myself and 4 officers. Now it's myself, a sergeant, and 8 officers. But work within the existing structure that you have with the crisis system. Most of the CIT training is free. And what I mean by people are willing to come and do the training. None of our instructors are paid for our CIT training, all the hours. So we're using community resources. We're using instructors from NAMI, people with lived experience that teach the course in my own voice that talks about their personal experience. There's other community providers. That's when we do our site visits. We go to Pathways, and our officers, with classes split in half, they spend 3 hours in a group therapy session with people in recovery. You can't tell the officers from the patients in recovery in the class, and they learn from each other. We go to Arundel Lodge, and these are trainings that don't cost us any money. And they just go in the morning when their clients are coming in for their day program, and they just have conversations with them to just learn about them and their stories. But also the people there learn about the officers and learn that they're humans. We work at the Board of Ed. We do a site tour at Rolling Knolls Elementary School, which is a region. It's a special school for the regional area for children with severe mental health and emotional challenges. so that when a patrolman gets called to the school for a 5-year-old out of control, they have an understanding. First, that the school system has exhausted all their resources, but also to go in with an understanding that this is behavioral health crisis, not a criminal justice. And the officer has the training and understanding. They've already met the school personnel and they understand. Excuse me. These are all trainings that are free. And there's so many other ones that we utilize. So the training is free. It's just getting departments to prioritize that the mental health training needs to be done.
And I think that you had your slide up with your contact information in it, and I'm assuming that folks that have follow-up questions could email you those questions and talk about this.
Absolutely.
One other question that I had for you, Lieutenant Thomas, was about officer and first responder wellness, and I know that that's a portion of your program. Are there any particular resources that you commend in that regard for officer wellness?
Yeah, so we've actually started, in addition to responding to traumatic incidents, we started our own officer wellness program. So I'll get to that point, but no, we follow all the procedures of International Critical Stress Foundation with the training for their grain class, group, and individual. We respond to all traumatic incidents. And sometimes it's officers calling in saying that they've been exposed or that their fellow officers have. Generally, it's the supervisors calling in saying, or they'll call me or the sergeant and say, hey, Steve, buddy, we just had a SIDS baby. Can you be at our lineup tomorrow? But at the same time, our mobile teams are letting us know too, because the patrol officer supervisors are calling the mobile crisis teams out to assist the community. Those same clinicians are recognizing what the officers are going through, and they're letting us know that we need to be there for the officers the next day. So we'll do one-on-ones, and we'll also do group interventions based on the incident. Our officer wellness program, we're really following 5 tenets. Corporal Betts, who's in charge of it, was in my CIT unit until last year when he really started the officer wellness. The first tenet is officers' physical health. What can we do to make sure they're physically healthy? So he's doing a lot of activities. Every week we have officer yoga where I go with my wife and my daughters, and it's other officers, their spouses, their children, but we do yoga together every Wednesday night. He does other activities where they do rucks, where it's hikes and things like that, where it's all officers going. They can talk to each other, but it's also physically healthy for them. He also supervises open gym times where officers can go. And again, they can we don't want it to be another time where they're separated from their family. So they can bring their children, not for babysitting. So we ask 12, 13 years or older, but they're there and they can spend time with their parents getting physically healthy together, or it could be their spouse or other family members. The second is their mental health wellness. And again, it's the looking at it from after traumatic incidents and what's traumatic for the officer. It could be personal or it could be professionally. And think how difficult it can be for an officer that they had at home a disagreement with their significant other. They go to work, and a half hour later in their first call, they're responding to a call in an apartment building where a neighbor heard an argument, and that couple is arguing in the same thing that she and their significant are arguing over. So it's those personalizing things that we want to have officers there that can be good listeners and listen non-judgmentally, have the training to be there, and if need be, link to additional resources. Third tenet is family wellness, so that officers have strong family social supports. And I think some of the things that helped me a lot in my career is knowing that I had strong family foundation, that I lived 2 blocks from my parents. My in-laws were less than a mile away. My wife and I, we've been married for it'll be 26 years in July. We've been together 31. But it's having that strong family, the social supports. But not every officer has that. What happens to the officer that moved out of state, moved from another state to come here to start their police career and doesn't have all these family supports here after that traumatic incident of someone that they can talk to or be with afterwards. Financial stability. It's letting officers recognize to live within their means, to provide financial services, and so forth, so that they are taking care of their family, but being responsible. One of the major problems that happens to officers through no fault of their own, they could get injured in the line of duty, not be able to work overtime or secondary employment, and they became dependent on that extra money. And now they're financially hurt. So it's to have that insight. And the final tenet is spiritual wellness. And that is for spiritual wellness, whatever it is for that person. But it's all that is completely individualized for that person and their family.
Lieutenant Thomas, thank you so much for your time today. On behalf of the Mental Health Association of Maryland and MEMS, we are so grateful to you for your insights. Your contact information is in the chat. Leah has just posted for our participants a link. If everybody could fill that out, it is very short evaluation of today's program. That would be wonderful. And again, Lieutenant Thomas, thank you so much. Please tell Jen Corbin that I hope crisis went okay, and we were sorry that we missed her.
I will. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.